History often forgets the quiet tragedies of the frontier, burying them under legends of gunfights and gold rushes. But in 1874, in the harsh dust of Copper Springs, Nevada, a crowd gathered not for a hanging, but for a sale. The merchandise wasn't cattle. It was a woman named Stacy Monroe and her 6-month-old son. They were being sold to cover a dead husband's gambling debts. It was a moment of absolute despair until a stranger, covered in the grime of the trail, rode a black mare into the square. He didn't pull a gun. He pulled a money clip. This is the true, twisted story of Thaddeus McCall, the man who bought a family to save his own soul, and the dark secret that nearly destroyed them all. The midday sun over Copper Springs did not offer warmth. It offered only judgment. It beat down on the shingled roof of the Mercantile and baked the mud of the main thoroughfare into a cracked, unforgiving mosaic. In the center of town, a makeshift platform had been constructed from empty whiskey crates and rough-hewn pine, standing like a gallows. Stacy Monroe stood atop it, her spine stiff as a rifle barrel. She refused to weep. Tears were a luxury for women who had futures, and Stacy knew, with the cold certainty of the grave, that her future had died 3 weeks ago in a mine shaft alongside her husband, Liam. In her arms, 6-month-old Thomas squirmed against the wool of her faded blue dress. The heat was making him fussy, his small whimpers cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a knife. Stacy rocked him gently, her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to make eye contact with the men gathered below. She knew them. She had served them coffee at the diner, stitched their shirts, and prayed alongside them in the small white chapel. Now, they were looking at her not as a neighbor, but as a ledger balance. "Order! I will have order!" The voice of Mayor Ezekiel Stroud boomed. Stroud was a man of immense girth and immense greed, sweating profusely in a linen suit that cost more than Stacy had ever seen in her life. He held a piece of paper in one hand and a heavy oak gavel in the other. "We are here to settle the outstanding accounts of the late Liam Monroe," Stroud announced, wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief. The deceased left a debt to the Copper Springs Mining Company and the Bank of Nevada totaling $400. By the laws of debt recovery and indentured service, the widow Monroe and her offspring are to be auctioned to satisfy this claim. The buyer assumes the debt, and the widow works it off. Term of service to be determined by the buyer. A low rumble went through the crowd. It was legal, technically a barbarous twisting of the law, often used in the territories to secure cheap labor, but it felt like a sin. "Do I hear $50? Stroud barked. "50, a voice called out from the front. It was Silas Vane. No, not Silas Arthur Vane, the owner of the local brothel. Stacy's stomach turned to ice. She tightened her grip on Thomas. If Vane bought her, she would not survive the year. She would throw herself into the canyon before she let Thomas grow up in Vane's establishment. "I have 50 from Mr. Vane. Do I hear 75? 75, shouted a farmer named Henderson. He was a widower with 6 children. He needed a mother for them, and a slave in the kitchen. It was a kinder fate than Vane, but a life of drudgery nonetheless. 100, Vane countered, smirking. The bidding stalled. $100 was a significant sum in 1874. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind whistling through the eaves of the saloon and the stamping of horses hitched nearby. "Going once," Stroud called out, raising the gavel. He looked at Vane with a conspiratorial nod. They had likely discussed this over brandy the night before. Going twice, the rhythmic clop, clop, clop of hooves interrupted the count. It wasn't a fast approach. It was deliberate. The crowd parted instinctively, making way for a rider on a massive, coal-black mare. The horse was lathered, suggesting a long ride, but the man in the saddle sat with an easy, dangerous grace. He wore a duster coat stained with the red clay of the Southern Territories. His hat was pulled low, casting a shadow over his eyes, but his jaw was covered in a thick, dark stubble that couldn't hide the grim set of his mouth. He looked like a man who had ridden through hell and hadn't bothered to brush the soot off his shoulders. He pulled the mare to a halt directly in front of the platform. The horse snorted, tossing its head. "We are in the middle of a legal proceeding," Stroud blustered, annoyed by the interruption. "State your business or move along, stranger." The cowboy slowly shifted his gaze from the mayor to Stacy. For a fleeting second, Stacy saw his eyes piercing blue, sharp as shattered glass. There was no lust in them, no pity. There was only recognition. "What's the debt?" the cowboy asked. His voice was gravel, low and rough from disuse. $100 is the current bid, Stroud said. But the total debt is $400. The cowboy reached into his saddlebag. He didn't hurry. Every movement was calculated. He pulled out a leather roll, untied the thong, and extracted a thick sheaf of banknotes. $500, the cowboy said. The crowd gasped. $500 could buy a prime herd of cattle or a small house. To pay it for a debt-ridden widow and a nursing infant was madness. Arthur Vane's cigar fell from his mouth. "Now see here. 500, the cowboy repeated, looking solely at Stroud. "Cash. Right now." Stroud's eyes bulged. Greed instantly warred with confusion, and greed won. $500. "Do I hear any other bids?" "Mr. Vane?" Vane spat on the ground and shook his head. "I ain't paying a king's ransom for a washerwoman." "Sold." Stroud slammed the gavel down so hard a splinter of wood flew off. "Sold to the stranger for $500. The cowboy dismounted. He walked up the steps of the platform, his spurs chiming with a cold, metallic music. He stopped in front of Stacy. Up close, he smelled of sweat, tobacco, and gun oil. He towered over her, frighteningly large. "Pack your things, Mom," he said quietly. "Who are you?" Stacy whispered, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "Name's Thaddeus McCall," he said. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand. He just turned to the mayor, counted out the money, and waited. "We ride in 10 minutes. The journey out of Copper Springs was an exercise in humiliation and terror. Stacy had hurriedly packed her meager belongings, a trunk of clothes, Thomas's blankets, a family Bible, and a singular, small tin-type photograph of Liam into the back of a buckboard wagon Thaddeus had purchased from the livery stable along with a mule. The town watched them leave. Curtains twitched in windows. Men paused their drinking on the porches. Stacy sat on the buckboard bench, Thomas asleep in a sling across her chest. Thaddeus rode his black mare alongside the wagon, holding the reins of the mule. They rode for hours in absolute silence. The landscape of Nevada changed as they moved away from the mining district. The rocky, scarred earth gave way to high desert scrub, vast and lonely. The wind picked up, howling through the sagebrush. Stacy kept glancing at the man riding beside her. Thaddeus McCall. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. Was he a bounty hunter? A train robber looking for a cover? Why had he paid $500? She wasn't worth $500. No domestic servant was. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada to the west, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, fear began to gnaw at her. They were miles from civilization. If he wanted to hurt her, no one would ever hear her scream. "Mr. McCall," she finally said. Her voice sounded thin in the open air. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "Yeah, where are we going?" "My ranch. About 2 days' ride north." "Why?" she asked, the question bursting out of her. "Why did you do that?" "I'm a stranger to you." Thaddeus pulled on the reins, slowing his horse to match the wagon's pace exactly. He looked at her then, and she saw a flicker of something haunted in his expression. "You ain't a stranger, Mrs. Monroe, and I didn't buy you for work." Stacy stiffened, her hand going to the small knife she had hidden in her boot. "If you think, I don't think nothing," he cut her off sharply. "And you can leave that pig sticker in your boot. You're safe with me. Safer than you've been in a long time." He looked away, adjusting his hat. "I knew Liam." The name hung in the air between them. Stacy felt the breath leave her lungs. "You knew my husband?" "We rode together. Before he met you. Before the mines." Thaddeus spurred his horse slightly, moving ahead as if to end the conversation. "We'll make camp at the ridge." That night, the silence returned. heavier than before. Thaddeus set up a lean-to for her and the baby, showing a surprising tenderness when he handed her a heated stone wrapped in flannel to keep Thomas warm. He slept on the other side of the fire, his back to her, his Winchester rifle resting across his chest. Stacy watched him through the flames. Liam had never mentioned a Thaddeus. Liam had told her he was a drifter who found God and settled down. He had never mentioned riding with men who looked like they had walked out of a nightmare. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, she saw Thaddeus take something out of his pocket. It was a pocket watch. He clicked it open, stared at the face of it for a long time, and then snapped it shut. The next day, the terrain grew rougher. They were climbing into the foothills. The air grew thinner and colder. By late afternoon, they crested a rise and looked down into a hidden valley. It was a bowl of green in the middle of the desert, fed by a spring that cut through the rock. In the center of the valley stood a ranch house. It had once been grand, built of sturdy timber and stone, but now it looked like a skeleton. The corral fences were leaning, the barn roof was sagging, and the weeds had claimed the garden. "Home," Thaddeus grunted. "It looks empty," Stacy said. "It is. Has been for 5 years." They descended into the valley. As they approached the house, Stacy noticed something that made her skin crawl. The front door was swinging slightly in the wind, creaking on rusted hinges, and on the porch, sitting in a rocking chair that moved with the breeze, was a doll, a child's porcelain doll. Its dress faded to gray by the sun. Thaddeus dismounted and walked to the porch. He picked up the doll with a reverence that didn't fit his rough hands. He dusted it off and set it on the railing. "You take the upstairs room," he told Stacy as he helped her down from the wagon. "I stay in the bunkhouse out back." "Mr. McCall," Stacy said, shielding Thomas from the wind. "You said you knew Liam. You said I wasn't a stranger. You owe me the truth. What is this place, and what do you want from us?" Thaddeus stopped at the door. He turned, and for the first time, he took off his hat. His hair was dark, streaked with premature gray at the temples. He looked exhausted, carrying a weight that $500 couldn't pay off. "Liam didn't die in a mining accident, Stacy," Thaddeus said, his voice flat. "He was murdered, and the men who killed him think he gave you something. Something they want back." Stacy stepped back, clutching the baby. "That's a lie. The foreman said it was a rock fall." "The foreman works for Stroud," Thaddeus said, "and Stroud works for the cartel that runs this territory. Liam stole a map, Stacy. A map to a vein of gold that doesn't belong to the company. He sent word to me 3 days before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I was to come get you." He pointed to the baby. He said he hid it with the boy. Stacy looked down at Thomas, sleeping peacefully in his swaddling clothes. She frantically felt the blankets, the hem of his clothes. "There's nothing here. Just his locket." Thaddeus's eyes dropped to the silver locket around the baby's neck, a cheap trinket Liam had won in a card game. "Don't open it," he warned softly. "Not yet. Stroud thinks you have it. That's why he put you up for auction. He wanted to buy you legal-like so he could tear your life apart looking for it. If he knew I had you." He looked out toward the ridge they had just crossed. "He'll be coming. We have maybe 2 days before he realizes who I am. By then, we need to be ready to fight." Stacy looked at the desolate, broken-down ranch, then at the hard-eyed man who had bought her. She realized with a jolt that she hadn't been rescued. She had been drafted into a war. "I don't know how to shoot," she whispered. Thaddeus pulled a heavy Colt Navy revolver from his belt and held it out to her. "Handle first. Then you'd best learn fast, Mrs. Monroe, because the devil is riding to Copper Springs, and he knows your name." The first night at the McCall Ranch was a siege of the mind. Stacy didn't sleep. She sat in the dusty armchair of the upstairs bedroom, the Colt Navy heavy and cold in her lap. The room smelled of lavender and decay, a woman's room, preserved in time. There were brushes on the vanity, a lace shawl draped over the mirror. It felt like the occupant had just stepped out for a moment. 5 years ago, downstairs, she could hear Thaddeus moving. He was boarding up windows. The rhythmic thud, thud, thud of hammer against wood was the only reassurance that he hadn't abandoned them. When dawn broke, gray and cheerless, Stacy ventured downstairs. The kitchen was a fortress. Thaddeus had pushed the heavy oak table against the back door. He was standing by the stove, brewing coffee that smelled like tar. "Drink," he said, shoving a tin cup toward her. "Who lived here?" Stacy asked, ignoring the coffee. She looked around at the faded domesticity of the house. "Who belongs to the doll on the porch?" Thaddeus's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. "My brother, and his wife, and their little girl, Clara." "Where are they?" "Buried on the hill," Thaddeus said, turning back to the stove. "Stroud's men came through here 5 years ago. Wanted the water rights. My brother said no." He turned to face her, his eyes dark. "I wasn't here. I was out riding, chasing whiskey and cards with your husband. By the time I got back, the smoke had already cleared." The revelation hit Stacy like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Liam. This was a blood feud. Thaddeus McCall wasn't a savior. He was an angel of vengeance, and she and Thomas were the bait. "You're using us," she said, her voice rising. "You brought us here to draw Stroud out." "I brought you here because it's the only place I can defend," Thaddeus countered, his voice rising to match hers. "Liam was trying to make things right, Stacy. He stole that map to buy you a way out, to buy us a way out of the life we led. He knew Stroud would kill him. He trusted me to finish it." He walked over to her, looming large. "I ain't a good man, Stacy. I never claimed to be. But I swore to Liam I'd keep you alive. And I keep my word." "Teach me," she said abruptly. Thaddeus blinked. "What?" "Teach me to shoot," Stacy said, setting the coffee down. "If they come for my son, I won't hide in the corner. Teach me." For the first time, a flicker of respect crossed Thaddeus's face. He nodded slowly. "All right. Put the boy down. We go out back." The next 2 days were a blur of bruising, recoil, and the smell of gunpowder. Thaddeus was a harsh teacher. He didn't coddle her. He made her fire until her hands blistered and her ears rang. "Aim for the center," he barked. "Don't look at the face. You look at the face, you'll hesitate. You look at the chest. It's a bigger target." Stacy learned. She learned to load the cylinder, to cock the hammer, to squeeze rather than pull. She learned that the kick of the gun was something to be managed, not feared. In the quiet moments between practice, an odd domesticity began to form. Stacy cooked stew from the dried rations Thaddeus had. Thaddeus fixed the roof where the rain was leaking in. They didn't speak much, but the hostility began to thaw. Stacy watched him with Thomas. The big man would never hold the baby, but he would watch him from across the room with a look of profound sadness. On the evening of the 3rd day, the atmosphere shifted. The birds stopped singing. The wind died down. Thaddeus was on the porch, cleaning his rifle. He stopped, his head cocked to the side. "Get inside," he said softly. "What is it?" Stacy asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Dust," he said, pointing to the south. "A lot of it. Riders." Stacy felt a cold hand clutch her heart. She ran inside, grabbed Thomas, and placed him in the heavy wooden chest at the foot of the bed, piling blankets around him to muffle the sound. She grabbed the Colt Navy and the box of cartridges. When she came back downstairs, Thaddeus was barring the front door. He looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a grim, terrifying smile. "You remember what I told you? Aim for the chest," Stacy said, her voice steady. "And keep one bullet for yourself," Thaddeus added grimly. "If they get past me, you don't let them take you, Stacy. You understand?" She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "I understand." "Good." Thaddeus smashed the glass of the window with the butt of his rifle and rested the barrel on the sill. "Here they come." From the ridge, a line of 6 riders appeared, silhouetted against the dying sun. In the lead, wearing a duster that looked too clean for the trail, was the foreman of the mine. And beside him, riding a massive gray gelding, was a man Stacy recognized with a shudder. It wasn't Mayor Stroud. It was a hired gun named Bolek, a man known in 3 territories for skinning his victims. Thaddeus, Stacy whispered. I see him, Thaddeus said, chambering around. Bolek. Stroud sent the butcher. Can we win? Thaddeus looked at her. We don't have to win, Stacy. We just have to kill enough of them that the rest decide it ain't worth the pay. He took a deep breath. When the shooting starts, you stay low. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. The riders stopped about 50 yards from the house. Bolek cupped his hands around his mouth. McCall, he shouted. We know you're in there. Send out the girl and the kid. Stroud just wants the locket. You give us that, and we ride away. Thaddeus didn't answer. He just adjusted his sight. He's lying, Thaddeus whispered. I know, Stacy said. McCall, Bolek yelled again. Don't be a fool. You're one man. Thaddeus squeezed the trigger. The shot Thaddeus fired didn't hit Bolek. It wasn't meant to. It struck the foreman, the man standing next to Bolek, square in the chest. The man crumpled without a sound, dropped by the sheer impact of the buffalo-caliber slug from Thaddeus's Sharps rifle. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence on the ridge. Then, hell arrived in the valley. Get down, Thaddeus roared, throwing his weight against Stacy, pinning her to the dusty floorboards just as the windows exploded inward. Bullets hammered the house like hail on a tin roof. They shredded the curtains, splintered the furniture, and punched holes in the plaster walls, sending up choking clouds of white dust. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of cracking wood, shattering glass, and the endless thunder of revolvers and repeaters from the men outside. Stacy pressed her face into the rug, covering her ears. She could hear Thomas screaming in the chest at the foot of the bed upstairs, a muffled cry of terror that tore at her heart. But she couldn't move. To stand up was death. Thaddeus was moving, though. He crawled on his belly toward the kitchen, toward the back windows. He was returning fire with his Winchester now. The lever action clack-clack boom, a steady rhythm against the chaotic fire coming from outside. Stacy, he bellowed over the din. The kitchen window. Watch the creek bed. They'll try to flank us. Adrenaline surged through her, burning away the paralysis of fear. She scrambled on her hands and knees into the kitchen, clutching the heavy Colt Navy. She pressed herself against the wall beneath the window Thaddeus had indicated. She risked a glance over the sill. The twilight was deep now, making shadows dance and stretch. Movement caught her eye, two shapes detaching themselves from the main group and creeping low along the dry creek bed that ran behind the house. I see them, Stacy yelled, her voice raw. Don't wait, Thaddeus grunted. He jerked violently, gritting his teeth as a splinter of wood, sent flying by a bullet, embedded itself in his cheek. He ignored the blood running into his beard. Stacy cocked the hammer of the Colt. It felt impossibly heavy. She remembered Thaddeus's voice. Aim for the chest. Don't hesitate. She rested the barrel on the windowsill, trying to steady her shaking hands. The lead figure in the creek bed paused, looking toward the house. She saw the glint of his gun. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil bucked hard against her palm, shocking her arm all the way to the shoulder. The boom of the big pistol inside the small kitchen was ear-splitting. She missed. Her bullet kicked up dirt 3 feet to the left of the man, but it had the desired effect. The two men scrambled back, diving behind the cover of a large boulder, shouting curses. Good girl, Thaddeus breathed. He was reloading his Winchester with practiced speed, shoving cartridges into the side gate. Keep them pinned. The siege lasted for what felt like hours. The sun was gone completely now, the valley lit only by the sickly yellow muzzle flashes and the rising moon. The attackers were cautious now. They had lost one man, and they knew the occupants of the house were armed and willing to fight. They pulled back to the edge of the trees, firing sporadically to keep Thaddeus and Stacy pinned down. During a lull in the shooting, Thaddeus slumped against the wall beneath the front window. His breathing was ragged. Are you hit? Stacy crawled toward him, panic fluttering in her chest. Just a graze, he lied. He put a hand to his left shoulder. His duster was slick with blood. A bullet had punched through the meat of his shoulder. It wasn't mortal, but he was losing blood fast, and his left arm was useless. Let me see, Stacy insisted, reaching for his coat. He pushed her hand away, his grip surprisingly weak. No time. Stacy, listen to me. We can't hold them forever. Once Bolek realizes I'm hurt, they'll rush the house. What do we do? Thaddeus reached inside his vest and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. He handed it to her. It was the locket, the cheap silver trinket Liam had worn. Open it, Thaddeus rasped, wincing as he shifted. Liam didn't have a map. Stroud thinks he did, but Liam wasn't a cartographer. He was a gambler. Stacy's fingers trembled as she pried open the stubborn clasp of the locket. Inside, there was no picture. There was no map. There was a small, tightly folded piece of vellum, no bigger than a postage stamp. She unfolded it carefully. It contained a series of numbers and letters written in Liam's hurried scrawl. C. S. Bank. Box 404. J. T. 1870. Stacy looked up, confused. What does it mean? Thaddeus stared at the paper, his eyes narrowing in recognition. A harsh laugh escaped his lips, turning into a cough. That sly son of a gun, Thaddeus whispered. It's not a gold mine, Stacy. It's leverage. It's the location of a safety deposit box in the Copper Springs Bank. J.T. stands for Jericho Turner, the bank manager before the current one. He was an honest man Stroud had run out of town. Thaddeus leaned his head back against the wall, the sweat beading on his forehead. Liam didn't find gold. He found Stroud's ledgers. The real ones. The ones that show how he's been skimming off the company and stealing claims from prospectors. He hid them in that box. This, he tapped the locket, is the key. The realization hit Stacy with the force of a physical blow. Liam hadn't died for greed. He had died trying to secure justice, trying to get something that could free the whole territory from Stroud's grip. Bolek doesn't want the map, Stacy said, her voice hardening. He wants to destroy the evidence. Exactly. Thaddeus struggled to sit up straighter. And if we die here, Stroud wins. He'll never find the box. But the secret dies with us. He looked at her, his blue eyes feverish but intense. You have to get to Copper Springs. You have to get that paper to the U.S. Marshal in the territory capital. He's the only one Stroud doesn't own. I'm not leaving you, Stacy said fiercely. You have the boy to think of, Thaddeus snapped. I bought you time. That's all I was ever good for. Before Stacy could argue, a new sound cut through the night, the whoosh of something igniting outside. A flickering orange glow lit up the windows. Damn them, Thaddeus hissed, trying to push himself up with his good arm. They got tired of waiting. Bolek had set fire to the barn. The dry, rotten wood went up like kindling. The blaze illuminated the entire yard, casting dancing, hellish shadows. The heat beat against the house, and smoke began to drift in through the broken windows. They're burning us out, Stacy whispered, horrified. They want us in the open, Thaddeus said. He managed to stand, swaying slightly. He grabbed Stacy's arm with his good hand. Change of plan. We aren't dying here tonight. Mrs. Monroe. Get the boy. We're leaving. The smoke was thick now, pooling near the ceiling of the kitchen. Upstairs, Thomas had started crying again, his small lungs irritated by the acrid air. Stacy scrambled up the stairs, staying low to avoid stray bullets that still zipped through the second-floor windows. She scooped Thomas out of the chest. His face was red and tear-streaked. She held him tight, murmuring soothing words he couldn't hear over the roar of the fire outside and the gunfire. She grabbed the diaper bag she had packed days ago and hurried back down. The kitchen was a furnace. Thaddeus was by the large hearth, using an iron poker to pry up a wide flagstone in the floor. "What is that?" Stacy asked, coughing. "My brother was paranoid," Thaddeus grunted, putting his back into the effort. The heavy stone grated aside, revealing a dark, square hole in the earth. A ladder disappeared into the blackness. Used this for smuggling whiskey during the Indian Wars. Leads to the old creek bed a quarter-mile west, past the tree line. Outside, Bolek's voice boomed over the crackle of the burning barn. "Last chance, McCall. Come out burning, or come out bleeding. Makes no difference to me." A flaming arrow thudded into the side of the house. The dry timber caught instantly. They heard the flames begin to lick up the exterior wall. The house was doomed. "Go," Thaddeus ordered, pointing to the hole. "Ladies first," Stacy countered, securing Thomas in the sling against her chest. She stepped onto the ladder. The air rising from the hole was cold and smelled of damp earth and mold. It was terrifying to descend into the earth while the world above burned. But the heat at her back gave her no choice. She climbed down into the pitch black. Thaddeus followed, sliding the flagstone back into place above them, plunging them into absolute darkness. The sounds of the fire and the gunfire were instantly muffled, replaced by the sound of their own breathing and the drip of water somewhere nearby. Thaddeus struck a match. The sudden flare of light was blinding. He lit a small tallow candle he'd taken from the mantel. The meager light revealed a narrow, low-ceilinged tunnel carved through packed earth and rock. It was shored up with rotting timbers that looked ready to collapse. "Stay close," Thaddeus said, his voice echoing strangely in the cramped space. He led the way, hunched over, his rifle held awkwardly in his good hand. The journey through the tunnel was a nightmare. The air was thin and bad. Spiderwebs brushed against Stacy's face. The ground was slick with mud. Every few yards, Thaddeus would stumble, weakened by blood loss. They stopped to rest in a slightly wider section of the tunnel. Thaddeus leaned heavily against a support beam, his face ashen in the candlelight. Stacy saw fresh blood soaking through the makeshift bandage on his shoulder. "Let me check it now," she demanded, setting Thomas down on a dry patch of sacking. Thaddeus didn't argue this time. He let her peel back his duster and vest. The wound was ugly, inflamed and bleeding sluggishly. Stacy used the last of their clean water to wash it, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind it tighter. As she worked, their faces close in the flickering light, Thaddeus looked at her. The hard edge in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, open pain. "It was my fault," he whispered. Stacy paused, her hands on his shoulder. "What?" "Liam. It was my fault he got caught." Thaddeus looked away, staring into the darkness of the tunnel. "We were supposed to meet at the crossroads that night. He had the papers he stole from the mine office. I was supposed to have fresh horses. We were going to ride for California. He swallowed hard. I didn't make it. I got into a poker game in a two-bit saloon 3 towns over, started drinking whiskey, lost track of time. By the time I got to the crossroads, Liam was gone. Stroud's men had found him waiting." Stacy sat back on her heels, stunned. The narrative she had built that Thaddeus was just Liam's old friend doing a good deed crumbled. He was the reason she was a widow. He was the reason Thomas would never know his father. "You let him die," she whispered, the anger rising hot and fast. "Yes," Thaddeus said. He looked back at her, his eyes pleading for nothing, expecting nothing. "He died because I was a drunk and a fool. When I heard what happened, when I heard they were selling you, it was the least I could do, to try and buy back a piece of what I broke." Tears streamed down Stacy's dusty cheeks. She wanted to hit him. She wanted to scream at him, but then she looked at his shoulder, the blood he was shedding for them now. She thought of him standing between her and Bolek's guns. $500 doesn't buy a life, Thaddeus, she said, her voice shaking. "I know. And saving us tonight won't bring Liam back. I know that too, Stacy." She finished tying the bandage, pulling it tight. He winced but didn't make a sound. "Then you'd better make sure we survive," Stacy said, wiping her tears fiercely. "Because if you die down here, then Liam really did die for nothing. You owe him a life. You owe us a life. Don't you dare quit on me now." Thaddeus looked at her, surprised by her steel. He nodded slowly. A strange tension filled the small space, born of grief, anger, and shared survival. He reached out with his good hand and gently touched a lock of hair that had fallen across her face. "I won't quit," he vowed. It was the closest he could come to an apology, and the closest he dared come to saying what was really in his heart. He picked up the candle. "Come on, the exit is near." They pushed on. The air grew fresher. Finally, the tunnel ended abruptly at a wall of loose rocks and roots. Thaddeus handed Stacy the candle and began pulling at the obstruction with his good arm. Dirt and stones cascaded down. With a final heave, he broke through. Cool night air rushed in. They crawled out into the open, coughing. They emerged into a dense thicket of brush in a dry creek bed. Behind them, a quarter-mile away, the McCall Ranch house was a towering bonfire against the night sky. They could hear the distant shouts of Bolek's men as they surrounded the burning structure, believing their prey was trapped inside. "They think we're dead," Thaddeus whispered, watching the blaze. "Good," Stacy said, pulling Thomas close, his locket cold against her chest. "Let them believe in ghosts. Now we go to Copper Springs." They had no horses. The buckboard and mule had burned in the barn. Thaddeus's black mare had likely spooked and run off during the shooting. They had to walk. The 10-mile trek back to civilization was an ordeal that tested the limits of their endurance. They walked through the night, using cattle trails and dry washes to stay hidden. Thaddeus, weakened by blood loss and fever, leaned heavily on Stacy. She bore his weight without complaint, fueled by a cold, simmering rage. She was no longer just a victim of circumstances. She was a woman on a mission. They reached the outskirts of Copper Springs just as the first gray hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. The town was asleep, quiet, save for the barking of a distant dog. "Where do we go?" Stacy whispered. They were huddled behind a stack of lumber near the livery stable. "The marshal's office is on Main," Thaddeus murmured, his skin burning hot. "But Stroud will have men watching it. We can't just walk in. We need help," Stacy said. She looked around the sleeping town. Her eyes fell on a small, neat house with flower boxes in the windows, just off the main drag. It belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Gable, the town seamstress. Eleanor was a formidable gossip, but she had always been kind to Stacy, slipping her extra fabric for Thomas's clothes when Liam was out of work. "There," Stacy said, pointing. "A seamstress?" Thaddeus doubted. "A woman who hates Stroud because he taxed her business nearly to death last year," Stacy corrected. They crept to the back door. Stacy knocked urgently, 3 sharp raps. It took a moment, then the door cracked open, revealing Eleanor in a nightcap, holding a rolling pin. "Who is it at this hour?" she demanded. "Eleanor, it's Stacy Monroe. Please." Eleanor gasped, pulling the door wider. She took in the sight of them. Stacy covered in soot and dirt, clutching the baby, and the massive, wounded man leaning against the doorframe. "Merciful heavens, child. The whole town thinks you're halfway to Mexico with a desperado. Get in here. Quickly." Eleanor ushered them into her kitchen. She bustled about, pulling the shades tight, stirring up the fire in the stove, putting a kettle on. She looked at Thaddeus's wound with a practical eye. "Nasty business," she tutted. She went to her cupboard and pulled out a bottle of rubbing alcohol and clean linen. "Sit him down, Stacy. I'll see to this. You feed that baby." While Eleanor tended to Thaddeus, cleaning the wound properly and stitching it up with the steady hands of a woman who had been sewing for 40 years, Stacy told her everything. The auction, the ambush, the locket, the fire. Eleanor listened, her lips pursed in a tight line of fury. When Stacy finished, Eleanor set down her needle. "Ezekiel Stroud is a boil on the backside of creation," Eleanor declared. "And it's high time someone lanced it. We need to get this paper to Marshal Davies," Thaddeus said, his voice stronger now that the wound was clean. "Before Stroud knows we're alive. Stroud is having breakfast at the hotel restaurant right now," Eleanor said, checking the clock on her wall. It was 7 a.m. He always does on Thursdays. Holding court, a plan began to form in Stacy's mind. A dangerous, theatrical plan. "Does he know what you look like, Thaddeus?" Stacy asked. "Only from a distance, in the dark. He wasn't at the auction." "Good." Stacy stood up, handing the sleeping Thomas to Eleanor. "Eleanor, can you watch him for an hour? And can you lend me your best Sunday dress? Something black, if you have it." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I think I know what you're about, Stacy Monroe, and I like it. I have a black bombazine morning gown that would fit you perfectly, and a veil. Thaddeus looked between the two women, confused. "What are you doing?" Stacy looked at him, her eyes hard and bright. "Stroud thinks I'm dead. He thinks he won. I'm going to walk into that hotel and prove him wrong. I'm going to finish what Liam started." "It's too dangerous," Thaddeus growled, trying to stand. "You can't stop me, Thaddeus. You can barely walk. Your job is to get to the marshal while I distract Stroud. Take the back alleys. Give this to Davies." She pressed the small folded vellum from the locket into his good hand. "Staci." She leaned down and kissed him on the cheek. It was brief, but electric. "Don't be late this time, cowboy." 20 minutes later, the doors of the Grand Copper Hotel restaurant swung open. The room was bustling with businessmen and ranchers eating steak and eggs. At the best table near the window sat Mayor Ezekiel Stroud, laughing loudly at his own joke, surrounded by sycophants. Conversation died as the woman entered. She was dressed in deep, expensive mourning black, her face obscured by a thick veil. She walked with a slow, regal bearing, straight toward Stroud's table. Stroud looked up, annoyance crossing his puffy face. "Madam, can I help you?" "This is a private table." Stacy stopped directly in front of him. The room was deathly silent now. Everyone was watching the strange widow. Slowly, deliberately, Stacy lifted the veil and threw it back over her hat. Stroud dropped his fork. His face went from red to a sickly shade of white. It was as if he were seeing a ghost. "Mrs. Monroe," he sputtered. "But you thought you killed me," Stacy said, her voice ringing clear through the dining room. "You thought you burned me and my son alive to cover up your crimes." "Preposterous," Stroud stammered, looking around for support, but his companions were shrinking away from him. "I bought your debt. I tried to help you. You killed my husband, Ezekiel Stroud, because he knew about Box 404. The mention of the box number hit Stroud like a physical blow. He leaped to his feet, knocking over his chair. "Seize her," he shouted to nobody in particular. "She's mad. She's hysterical." The doors of the restaurant burst open again. But it wasn't Stroud's hired thugs who entered. It was U.S. Marshal Jeb Davies, a man with a reputation as straight as a surveyor's line, holding a Winchester. Behind him was Thaddeus McCall, looking pale but standing tall, his Colt Navy drawn. And behind them, looking sullen and defeated in handcuffs, was Bolek. He had been caught trying to sneak back into town after the fire. "Sit down, Ezekiel," Marshal Davies said calmly. "We have some reading to do down at the bank." Stroud looked at Stacy, his eyes full of venom. Then he looked at Thaddeus, and the realization dawned on him. "You," Stroud snarled at Thaddeus. "The bitter." "The name is McCall," Thaddeus said, his voice gravel. "And I believe you owe this lady an apology, and her freedom." The following segments conclude the saga of Stacy Monroe and Thaddeus McCall, bringing the story to its dramatic climax and resolution. The atmosphere in the Copper Springs Bank was as cold as a mausoleum. Outside, a crowd had gathered, their murmurs growing into a restless roar, as word spread that the ghost of the Monroes had returned to haunt the man who had ruined them. Marshal Davies stood by the heavy iron gate of the vault, his hand resting on his holster. Thaddeus leaned against a marble pillar, his face pale from the morning's exertion, but his eyes never left Ezekiel Stroud. Stroud sat on a velvet stool, sweat soaking through his silk collar, looking less like a king and more like a cornered rat. "The key, Ezekiel," the marshal said, his voice a low rumble. "I don't have it," Stroud hissed. "This is a violation of my rights. I am the mayor. I am the law in this town." "Not today," Thaddeus said, stepping forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small piece of vellum Stacy had kept safe. He handed it to the bank's new clerk, a young man named Miller who hadn't yet been bought by Stroud's gold. "Box 404, Miller whispered, checking the ledger. He looked at Stroud with a mixture of fear and realization. "Sir, the mayor doesn't have the key. Mr. Monroe had it. He registered it under a pseudonym months ago." The vault was opened with a heavy, grinding groan of metal. From the small copper box, the marshal extracted a thick stack of papers, ledgers, signed contracts, and letters that detailed every bribe, every stolen claim, and the cold-blooded orders to remove obstacles like Liam Monroe. The marshal flicked through the pages. His expression grew grimmer with every turn. Ezekiel Stroud, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and the accessory to the murder of Liam Monroe. As the marshal reached for his handcuffs, the silence was shattered. One of Stroud's remaining loyalists, a deputy who had been hiding in the shadows of the mezzanine, fired a shot. The bullet chipped the marble inches from Thaddeus's head. "Run!" Stacy screamed, diving behind the teller's counter. Chaos erupted. Thaddeus didn't run. He drew his Colt with a speed that defied his injuries. He fired upward, the bullet finding the deputy's shoulder and sending him tumbling over the railing. Stroud took the opportunity to bolt for the back exit, his heavy frame surprisingly fast in his desperation. "He's getting away!" Stacy yelled. Thaddeus didn't hesitate. He ignored the fire in his shoulder and vaulted over the counter, hitting the floor and rolling. He chased Stroud into the alleyway behind the bank. Stacy followed, her black dress billowing behind her, her heart hammering against her ribs. She reached the alley just in time to see Thaddeus corner Stroud against a stack of crates. Stroud had pulled a small derringer from his vest, but Thaddeus was faster. He had the barrel of his Navy Colt pressed against Stroud's throat. "Give me a reason, Ezekiel," Thaddeus growled, his voice a vibration of pure, unadulterated rage. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't send you to see Liam right now." Stroud whimpered, the derringer slipping from his trembling fingers. "I have money, more than 500. I can make you a rich man, McCall." "I already spent my money," Thaddeus said, his eyes cold as the Nevada winter. "I bought something you'll never understand. I bought justice." Thaddeus didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he slammed the butt of his pistol into Stroud's temple, knocking the man unconscious. He looked up and saw Stacy standing at the mouth of the alley. The sun was finally fully over the horizon, casting a long, golden light down the dirt path. The nightmare was over. A month later, the dust in Copper Springs had finally settled. Stroud was in a federal prison awaiting trial, his empire dismantled and returned to the families he had robbed. Stacy Monroe sat on the porch of a small, clean cottage on the edge of town, the property Liam had dreamed of owning. The black morning dress was gone, replaced by a simple yellow cotton gown. Thomas sat in the grass at her feet, gurgling at a grasshopper. The sound of hooves approached. Stacy didn't have to look up to know who it was. The black mare, now sleek and rested, stopped at the gate. Thaddeus McCall sat in the saddle, his gear packed tight. He looked different, the haunted shadows in his eyes had faded. "You're leaving," Stacy said, walking to the gate. "The marshal offered me a badge," Thaddeus said, tilting his hat. "But I think I've had enough of Nevada. Heading north, maybe Oregon." "You don't have to go," she said softly. "The debt is paid, Thaddeus. You don't owe Liam anything anymore." Thaddeus looked down at his hands, the hands that had bought her at an auction and held her through a fire. "It ain't about what I owe Liam anymore, Stacy." He dismounted and stood before her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He handed it to her. Inside was $500 in gold coins. "The money you spent," she whispered. Stroud's assets were seized. "The reward for the ledgers was more than enough," he explained. "Take it, for the boy's schooling." Stacy looked at the gold, then at the man. She realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't a widow, a debtor, or a victim. She was a woman with a choice. "Stay," she said. It wasn't a plea, it was a command. "The ranch. Your brother's place. It needs a man who knows how to build things instead of breaking them. And Thomas, he needs to know the man who saved us." Thaddeus looked at the horizon, then back at Stacy. The wind caught her hair, and for a moment, he didn't see a widow. He saw a future. "I'm a hard man to live with, Stacy Monroe," he warned, though there was a catch in his voice. "And I'm a woman who's lived through fire," she replied, reaching out to take his hand. "I think we'll manage." Thaddeus McCall didn't ride away. He tied his horse to the fence, picked up the laughing boy from the grass, and walked into the house he had bought not with gold, but with his soul. The story of the Widow Monroe and the cowboy who rode up late is a testament to the fact that even in the lawless reaches of the Old West, honor can be found in the most unlikely places. It wasn't just a transaction. It was an act of profound redemption that changed the course of Nevada history. Stacy and Thaddeus's legacy lives on in the valley that still bears the McCall name, reminding us that no matter how dark the night, justice eventually finds its way home. If this story moved you, please show your support. Like this video to help us share more forgotten tales of the frontier. Share it with anyone who loves a good Western drama, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We have many more stories of grit and grace coming your way. What would you have done in Thaddeus's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.